I'm Vivian Gadsden from the University of Pennsylvania, and I'm joined by Executive Director Felice Levine from AERA, and we are delighted that you're here with us today. We're delighted in particular because this is such an important topic and the urgency of it just couldn't be more poignant. But as we were preparing for this, I remember that in April 1999, during the week of AERA in Montreal, the first of what we might call mass school shootings in modern history occurred in Columbine. We were shocked as scholars, researchers, practitioners, and policymakers, as parents, aunts, uncles, and grandparents. Before then and since, in communities throughout the country, we have experienced the effects of gun violence. As recent as Parkland and the ongoing relentless neighborhood violence in low-income urban communities, violence decimating the hopes, the dreams, and the lives of children and families. What is the role of research and researchers in identifying the background issues in the tenuous public debates, in unpacking the broad net of the violence, and in addressing the implications for schools and communities? Where and how do we contribute to making the difference in building appropriate practices and responsive policies? In this, one of the first sessions of the 2018 annual meeting, we at AERA acknowledge the criticality of the problem and honor the lives of children, teachers, and families who've been affected by the violence. It is appropriate that AERA should address the complex issues of gun violence that threaten both schools and communities, the ways students travel in and between them and the other important settings where they learn, and the obstacles to young people achieving their promise. By focusing on what we might call our craft, we aim to point our field in the direction of weighing and interrogating the issues. And we are joined by an outstanding array of researchers whose scholarship and work in the world have focused on different dimensions of the problem. But before I hand it over to Felice, I want to read an essay that, as it turns out, was just shared with me yesterday by a 13-year-old whom I've known since when she was a thought. Her father is the chaplain at the University of Pennsylvania, where I teach, and her grandfather is known to many of you as John Fantuzzo, my colleague at the University of Pennsylvania. And she may be watching this, so I want to thank her for allowing me to read it. It was an article in the WHYY online magazine, and it's titled Hope versus Fear, a 13-year-old's experience at the March of Our Lives. She begins by saying, "Tell me what democracy looks like. This is what democracy looks like. Hey, hey, ho, ho, the NRA has got to go." I marched with my younger sister and my dad in Philadelphia on March 24th. And by the way, I am reading excerpts. When I first heard about the shooting in Parkland, Florida, my first thought was, another one? I'm ashamed that I couldn't jump to compassion for the grieving families, the students, and the faculty and staff. Instead, I was becoming a part of the terrible reality that we are living in, where gun violence, whether through mass shootings like this one, or police brutality, or even just random shootings, are the norm. The more my classes talked about it, and the more time that I got to process it, Parkland began to feel different from the other shootings I was used to hearing about. The students at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School seemed to be a lot like me and the students at my school. My name is Rissa Howard. I'm 13 years old and in 8th grade. My school district is one of the top public school districts in the state, and even in the nation. I've also felt very safe at my school, but after the Parkland shooting, it felt like the little bubble I was living in got popped. Some of my teachers started going over safety procedures and what to do if a shooter came to our school. Doors that had always been left open began to get locked. Everyone kept saying that Parkland was considered one of the safest neighborhoods in Florida, just like how my neighborhood is considered one of the safest neighborhoods in Pennsylvania. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this kind of thing could happen anywhere. I just got lucky. I began to feel afraid. Things felt out of my control. What can a 13-year-old do? The march on March 24th was my second major protest. My first was Black Lives Matter protest. But I still wasn't very sure what to expect. When I got there, I was speechless. Thousands of people were all gathered in one place, and all with the same purpose, to do something about gun violence. What struck me the most, though, were all the different types of people who showed up. There were a lot of high school and college students, of course. They were the super hype ones, starting all the chants, jumping up and down, and holding inspiring signs. I also saw a lot of teachers who were protesting the idea of arming them in school. I was excited to see kids younger than myself at the march who were just as involved as the adults. There were also older marchers holding signs. One read, "I'm marching for my grandchildren." There were people carrying Black Lives Matter signs, LGBTQ flags, signs in Hebrew. There were people pushing newborn babies, playing guitars, banging on drums. And there were people like me just walking and taking it all in. We were turning our fear into action. I wasn't sure that I would have been brave enough to do a lot of things that I saw others doing. Courage can be found in many different forms. It might be speaking out against gun violence or the gun industry, even when you're tempted to be like all the others around you who aren't. It might be making a sign to change someone's mindset at a march. There are so many awesome things that you can do. The most important thing, though, is to keep going. Don't just stop after one march. Even after the Parkland shooting, a lot of teens are still falling victim to gun violence and losing their lives from police brutality or more school shootings. Stand up for what you believe in, even if it seems like no one is on your side. If there's one thing we've learned from the Never Again movement, it's that it's not always the important people who make the biggest changes. Sometimes it could just be a group of teens who don't want others their age to experience the horrors they have been through. And she does end with, "We shall overcome." Let's take heart and let's engage in a vigorous conversation today. Thank you all. Felice?
So this session today is about that vigorous conversation. We've called it a town hall meeting because really it is as much about you and what you're going to contribute to this conversation and what we are going to do after today. It's ironic and maybe quite appropriately coincidental that the March for Science is tomorrow. And one of the featured topics that the March for Science worldwide and with a definite presence across the United States has emphasized is that violence research is a health issue. It's an issue that we must address. We must generate the necessary knowledge. This has been a pernicious and long-term issue in our culture and our society for years. You can see from the yellowed pages of this book, not because I've read it a lot, which I have, but because this book is approaching 50 years old, American Violence, a Documentary History, Richard Hofstadter. Going all the way back in the early origins of various forms of violent episodes. I myself did a agenda-setting book about research based on a workshop then undertaken at the American Sociological Association with the title, The Social Causes of Violence, Charting a Research Agenda. And I myself get so unsettled when I go back. First, at some level, you're sort of embarrassed that you weren't so sophisticated, but at another level, oh my God, look at these issues that we still really need to invest in. So this session is, though, a bit about what we don't know and where we need to go, because that's a very motivating issue for all of us in the research community, in the prevention and practice community, but we also know a great deal. And so what we're going to have today is some brief talks to get some facts on the table, to get some reflections on the table. This is not just about schools. This is not just about single communities. These are workplace issues, church and temple issues, schools across the strata of racial and ethnic populations and communities that are more affluent and less affluent, urban and rural, and we need to grapple with this as a community together. So now, may we begin. Let me just say a word for all of you joining us virtually. We hope you continue the conversation with us. We have mics in the room, and we really want to engage you all in this discussion. I want to particularly welcome several, 4 or 5 that we have with us. If you just stand up for a moment from the Urban Assembly Program, we are thrilled that you've been able to be with us. And I want to say, I think it's so palpable for all of us, even though I may still see myself as the youth within me, we know how much we have learned from you and how much you matter. And if we didn't anchor on that before, the last number of months has made that just so palpable. So please recognize that our work, our research, our actions, and our interactions are all enriched by learning from you about the experiences that you have. And so I want to first, in sequence, introduce Ron Astor at my immediate left, the Steinwood Professor in the School of Behavioral Health and also, I think, Education at the University of Southern California. And to his left, pleased to introduce Pedro Noguera, Distinguished Professor of Education at the University of California, Los Angeles, who's walked the streets of New York quite a bit and spent a nice solid portion of his career also at New York University. Matt Mayer, Associate Professor of Education Psychology at Rutgers University. David Adams, Director of Socio-Emotional Learning at the Urban Assembly, and I guess I'll say also a special shout out to you for being so sensitive to the need for us to really have the voices of youth in our room at this time at our meeting. And David Osher, Vice President and Institute Fellow at the American Institutes for Research. And Catherine Newman at his left, Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs for the University of Massachusetts System. I've introduced them all at once, a little bit reflecting on actually how much time some of us have spent together on this very issue. And where these folks at my immediate left are just devoting huge amounts of time, energy, socio-emotional commitment, as well as academic commitment. And I've always been honored to the extent I've been able to take some of my own professional life and be a fellow traveler. So with this, let me turn it over to Ron. Each person will speak for no more than 7 minutes, and then start thinking about what you'd like to know. We'll have a conversation here, but this conversation really needs to engage all of us today. Ron.
Thank you. I want to first off by acknowledging you again for being here, and I hope that during the course of this discussion, your voices will be heard, either during or afterwards. I'm really looking forward to hearing, because so much of the work that I do, along with my colleague Rami Benishti, who's here from Israel, and Veronica Lopez, who's here with Bruno, baby Bruno, it's really about the current lives that you're living, and it's about the future. And it's not just the experiences that you all feel as youth or that we feel as teachers or educators. It's really, in my opinion, these shootings, starting from Columbine, and even earlier. Elliot Turiel, my advisor, is here in the room. Sorry for all the shout outs, but he knows that I've been working on this issue from the early 80s, long before the shootings came. The communities in Richmond and Oakland were experiencing gun violence, and I was seeing it. We were having duck drills. So it's been there. What's happened is these mass shootings, particularly in white suburban settings, have actually raised the discussion for the first time in a serious way in our country. And now it's an opportunity to talk about all, even though they're separate in shape, there's things similar to the youth voice in our work that we've done in Israel and Veronica Lopez in Chile and in California that are common and I think are very important. So I do think we're in the midst of a battle right now, a national battle that the shootings have started about what the nature of our schools are going to be, and also what the nature of our society is going to be. On one hand, you have one side saying, responding to the shootings, wanting to harden law enforcement, zero tolerance, harsh measures that make schools feel almost prison-like across the board. On the other hand, you have AERA, which I don't believe we even have one researcher arguing for that other. The research is overwhelmingly in support of better relationships, of actually building everything off of the student voice and the teacher voice in the school, of pushing social climate and social emotional integrated with academics, as we're going to hear here, so that it's a meaningful experience and it's a real experience, regardless of whether you're in Parkland or you're in Richmond or you're in Oakland. So there's a bigger battle that's being fought here, and I think I want to make that explicit. So much of the work that I've done with Rami and Veronica, and with, again, last shout out, I promise, my wife's in the room and she's been a principal and in education for 34 years, so we spent a lot of time outside of AERA talking about this too. So much of it has to do with the mission and the focus of the school, and we see the principals, the superintendents, the educators now are for the first time part of this discussion. Up until now, we've really been talking about programs and evidence-based programs, what I call air conditioning, coming from the window air conditioning rather than central air. And I feel for the first time we're now talking about integration and moving some of these softening of the school and the social emotional, the relationships with the academic mission. Again, this is what's been happening in Israel in their system. Chile is struggling with it right now. As we see with the Every School Succeeds Act, this is all being pushed really by the shootings. The shootings have pushed these ideas forward to be thinking. So the evidence is overwhelming in terms of our research that one approach, the social emotional approach, the climate and the integration, is actually helpful not only in just making our schools better, but actually in reducing the severe kinds of settings that we could talk about. And I'd like to give you a few examples from our 140. Give me a minute or two example when I need to. Most people separate. They say, oh, well, climate is a prevention issue. But what we found in our work as well, that if you have actually schools where students feel comfortable speaking, they know they could save their friends' lives, they have great relationships with their teachers and principals, they're creating A+ human beings, not just A+ students, as I'd like to kind of coin. Those students are actually going to try and save their friends' lives. When they hear of something, they actually move forth. And we've done this with 145 schools in the San Diego area, working on issues of climate, resources, moving it into the DNA of the school, not just as, so it's sustainable. So the teachers, the principals, the parents all have this knowledge that we're talking about, including social workers and psychologists and other people helping too, but really moving it into the focus of the school. And I want to start off by saying in this district with 145 schools, 8 districts, over 117,000 kids, in this 8-year period we had focusing on the positive social climate, not police officers, not guns in the schools, 55% reduction in gun carrying on school grounds, reported from the youth, 38% reduction in people being threatened by weapons on school grounds or at school events, a 40% reduction in seeing weapons. Remember, just think of it. We talk about the shootings, but what about seeing weapons on school firearms? That changes how you feel. That changes how you feel before you go to your math class. We have to be talking about that. And a 44% reduction in gang affiliation. So the split between social climate and weapon reduction or threats is a false one, I believe. And I think if we're not just thinking about prevention, we're thinking about the more severe issues, we have to start integrating it. I think my colleagues and I have been suggesting a public health approach to deal with this. In other words, rather than just looking at individual students and trying to find only the shooter, we need to be finding schools that have high reports from students, their voices in terms of weapons being on school grounds, feeling threatened. And we see this in California. We have, by the way, all the data that exists. We just don't have the will to actually go to those schools and provide the right supports, the community supports, the training that's needed for the principals, to use other principals who have turned it around and actually help those schools go forth so they could have more welcoming, more caring, more supports all around, so to reduce this in the same way that we've done here. It's very possible to actually, we have the data on each school, for example, in California, and we could go and we could actually use that approach. Other countries have done it as well. The last piece that I kind of want to mention, am I okay time-wise?
Judiciously, you're fine.
Okay, great. Two more things then, since I'm judiciously fine. One just spontaneously generated. What you hear here today, the most ironic piece for me is that you won't see it in our schools of education, our university schools of education. You don't see it commonly in the teacher ed program, principal, superintendent training. We train in one way, and then everybody has to be retrained once they get into the field again. We need to, that's our fault. We have to actually take the science and take the information we have and move it central air, not window air conditioning, for every teacher, principal, superintendent, and even school board members, because what we're seeing is that these evidence-based programs we have now, once the grants are done, once the money dries up on the outside, all those programs don't sustain themselves over time as well, too. So I think I'm going to end with that. I'd like to end also with thanking you once again, and I don't know if baby Bruno is back in the room, but we're doing this for you, so we appreciate it.
Thank you. Hey, Joe.
Thank you. And first, I want to thank AERA for organizing the session. I know it wasn't originally part of the plan, but it's important to be flexible and to be relevant and responsive. So I'm happy to be part of this. And like Ron, I've been involved in this work for many years. And so the main thing to keep in mind is that these are not new issues, that we've been dealing with this, not just since Columbine even, but we've been, many of us know that interpersonal violence in schools and in communities has been an issue we've been struggling with for a very long time. I have a community center in the Bronx named after my cousin who was stabbed to death in 1974. And on his way from school. And so these are, again, not new issues, but our ability to grapple with them has gotten not much better. So I do want to say it's important to keep in mind, I'm sure Catherine will speak about this further, that we can't lump all school shootings in the same category, because they're not the same. Right after Parkland, there was the shooting at Great Mills in Maryland. Very different. People died, but the one at Great Mills, the assailant knew the people he was going for. They'd been involved with each other. Those kinds of shootings are very different, and therefore the response has to be different too. And we need to think differently in terms of how we prevent. I think what concerns me now, because of the hysteria that we're seeing, and the hysteria is understandable because people feel threatened, but it's very important to keep in mind that the path we're going down is unlikely to be one that leads to real prevention, right? That is that we will never have enough police for every school. We don't even have the money to provide armed guards at every school. When we consider the fact that it's not just schools, but shopping malls, churches, hospitals, concerts that are all vulnerable where we've had these incidents, if we go down that path, then we literally need to have armed guards almost everywhere, because there's no place now in this country that we can say is safe. So once we accept that, then it's forced to be a lot more creative in how we approach this. I'm concerned because immediately the Trump administration blamed the reduction or the focus on reducing suspensions under the Obama administration as one of the factors, even though in fact the young man who shot up Parkland was suspended at the time. Again, it speaks to the way in which lack of information, lack of research is driving a lot of the responses. And I think all of us should be concerned about that. there are things we know about patterns. We know, for example, that bullying is often a factor in these incidents. We know mental health, unaddressed mental health concerns are often a factor, or other young people who are at risk. We know that in many cases, people knew something was amiss, right? Either other students, teachers, counselors, but the mechanisms to respond effectively weren't in place. And there are other things we know about these incidents that can help us as we start to think through what prevention should look like. And obviously the need for prevention is what we should be focused on. The young people here, I'm sure from Urban Assembly, are you all from the school where the child was killed?
I'm sorry?
Are you all from the school where the kid was killed? Was stabbed? No, you're not that school. Okay. Well, there's another Urban Assembly school, yeah, where that occurred, and it meets that other pattern, right? Where a bullying of people who knew each other, and once you start to unpack the issues, it becomes a lot murkier because the line between the victims and the perpetrator are not always so clear-cut, right? And so knowing what we're dealing with, I can't say enough, is an essential part of thinking through a strategy for how to respond. Because the responses in urban areas may end up looking very different than in suburban communities. As one study I saw recently said, in most of the suburban communities and rural communities, the victims were white, were middle class, had relatively good grades, and wanted to be known. Right? In most urban areas, the assailants don't want to be known, right? And knew who they were going after. These are very important distinctions, and not to be kind of just washed over. So if we were in a different kind of country, we would be talking about gun control right now, right? And we would talk about background checks, and we would talk about why it's important not to have assault weapons in the hands of 18-year-olds, and things that make sense. We're not in that country, right? And so sadly, many of the things that would help us are not even on the table, because Congress has not yet moved towards serious gun control or implementing measures to make it more difficult to get weapons in the hands of children or adults. So what can we do in the short term? If the goal is not to go down the path of zero tolerance, and Ron just told me that if you were to visit Stoneman Douglas now, a couple dozen police officers are there, and hardly an environment conducive to good teaching and learning. When I worked with South Philly High School a few years ago, was going through similar issues, not because of a mass shooting, but because of violence at schools. They literally put a police station in the school. Meanwhile, kids were still experiencing violence right outside of school. So that path, much less the idea of arming teachers, right, is not one that I think shows a whole lot of promise. At the same time, we know, and I'm sure David Osher will speak to this, and my own research has shown this, listening to students shows the real promise. Because if we were to have mechanisms for knowing students, they are more likely to tell you when problems are brewing. And then over and over again in these cases, what we knew is that students knew there were problems, students knew there were threats, adults didn't, or adults didn't respond adequately. The lack of counselors, if we're going to have to choose between armed guards or more counselors, I would put the emphasis on the counselors, because we need adults who are trained, who can build connections and stronger relationships with young people, and that's clearly something that we are in short supply of in many of our schools. I would also say, having served on the Center for Disease Control Task Force on Youth Violence in 1990, right? One of the big breakthroughs of that task force was to get violence declared a public health issue.
Yep.
Right? And why that was important was it gave us new tools for thinking about and responding to the violence. That is, that once you start to see violence as not simply a criminal issue, but as a health issue, then you start to realize, well, then we need to approach this differently, the way we would a disease or some other health problem facing our country. And I think that's the direction we need to go in. We need to think about how to create schools where students are well known, how to create support systems for students who are in need. We have kids out there with either diagnosed or undiagnosed mental health conditions that need much more support than they're receiving right now. And we have communities. We're in the middle of a mental health crisis. It's estimated anywhere from 30 to 50% of the people behind bars right now have mental health conditions, and similar numbers for the homeless on our streets. So we are living in a society with very little in the way of a social safety net. For many of our children, the schools are all that exists of the social safety net in this country. And so if we're going to focus on schools, we have to focus on how to build support systems in schools that will make violence less likely.
Matt.
Hi. I'm going to quickly touch on 3 related areas. First, the recent call for action to prevent gun violence in the U.S. by the 19-member interdisciplinary group on preventing school and community violence. 4 members are here: Dr. Astor, Dr. Noguera, Dr. Osher, myself. Next, I'll speak to 10 areas, just mentioning them, where we need to focus additional research. And finally, mention a few larger societal level issues that we need to start talking about. And we've already heard some of that in the remarks by Dr. Noguera and Astor. Following the Parkland shooting, an interdisciplinary group developed an 8-point call for action, and this was really the 3rd such effort, the first being in 2006 in the fall, again following Sandy Hook in 2012. And those earlier 2 position statements were really strategic and systemic think pieces. But this more recent statement was different in that it was an actionable document. It's been widely disseminated and endorsed by major organizations in education and the allied disciplines, representing over 5 million professionals. And if you would like a copy on your way out, it's sitting on a chair near the doors. I'm going to simplify the document quickly because I have some other things to say. First, it does follow a public health prevention approach, and with a multi-tier structure at the first level, saying we need to promote positive school climates and make sure our schools are not only physically safe, but emotionally and psychologically safe. Second, we need to ban assault-style weapons, high-capacity ammo clips, and products that modify these semi-automatic firearms to perform as if they're automatic. On the second tier, we need, echoing Dr. Noguera's comments, we need adequate staffing of coordinated school and community-based mental health services for at-risk individuals. We need to reform school discipline to reduce exclusionary practices and foster social, emotional, behavioral, and academic success for students. We need universal background checks for anyone buying firearms. On the third level, we need a national program to train and maintain school and community-based threat assessment teams using either the Virginia or another vetted model that's research-based. We need to remove legal barriers to sharing safety-related information among educational, mental health, and law enforcement agencies in special cases where a person has threatened violence and there's an imminent danger. And finally, laws establishing gun violence protection orders that can allow the courts to issue time-limited restraining orders requiring that law enforcement take firearms from dangerous individuals, again, where there's an imminent danger. Going on to touch on a few research areas where we need to do more. Well, first, obviously, we need to do more work in firearms-related violence, access issues, statutory and regulatory issues, and we need to adopt an epidemiological framework. Second, we need to continue on the work of Dr. Cornell at Virginia and others in threat assessment models. Third, we need to understand better these variable outcomes we're seeing and sometimes negligible outcomes from these commercially sold package prevention products for bullying, school climate, and so forth. Fourth, we need to build on the current work in school climate assessment and in particular linkages to prevention planning and school operations. Next, we need to better understand the differences and issues involved in school only versus school, family, community prevention partnerships. And related to that, we need to better understand barriers to and related solutions for providing well-integrated, comprehensive programs in schools. We need to really understand the outcomes of using logic models and theories of change and theories of action in school safety programming. Basically, what difference does using them make, and how important is it? We need to explore, building on work by Clayton Cook, Dmitrovich, and several others, future pathways to blending elements of school-wide positive behavioral supports and social emotional learning. We need rigorous research on school resource officers. Most of the research is other than rigorous. And finally, we need to better understand gaps in bridging research to policy and practice. This brings me to my final area. We need to start talking more about larger societal level issues. First, to what degree are Americans, just everyday people, invested in their life as agents of social change in their own country? I want you to consider the Olveus Bullying Prevention Program. Why did we see better results in the Scandinavian research, yet in the North American implementations, it didn't do very well? Now, above and beyond anyone raising an issue of the relative homogeneity of the populations involved, I would ask you to consider that in the Scandinavian countries, there is likely a greater percentage of the population who are invested in the concept that they themselves are partners in a process of social change and social improvement. Do we have that mindset here? I think this is a direction we need to explore. Second, and this comes back to Dr. Astor's comment about the will to do things. Are we seriously interested at a deep level in changing things surrounding gun violence? I want you to consider a different area by comparison. Think about reading in elementary schools. Now, we've known for decades that we have a problem in this country. We know the educational trajectory and the life course trajectory of poor readers is pretty dismal. There's not much disagreement on that. Yet we don't seem to have the will as a country to come to grips with this issue. And I'd say we lack the national will to massively invest in long-term infrastructure and related capacity to address reading issues. I wonder likewise if we have the will to address longer-term challenges surrounding gun violence in our communities and schools. Finally, I'm wondering perhaps it's this perception that our collective social ills are so large and with us forever, and it's just some fool's errand to take them on, especially as researchers in the educational community. But I would argue, as my colleagues have spoken, that we need to think much more as educators and educational researchers about action-oriented partnerships with all stakeholders working in many ways towards change, top-down, bottom-up. But the challenges are immense. Thank you.
Thank you. David.
All right, well, good evening. David Adams, Director of Social Emotional Learning at the Urban Assembly. As a brief background, the Urban Assembly is a network of 21 public schools here in New York City. We focus on social and economic mobility of our young people who are here today by delivering life skills and academic development for their success. And it's in that context that I want to tell you a brief story that relates to this concept of violence and how we address it in our nation's schools. It comes about 6 months ago. I'm thinking in one of our schools in Harlem, a young woman armed not with a weapon, but armed with a screenshot from Snapchat and Facebook, approaches another young woman with her friends behind her, egging her on, telling her to keep going, this is the right thing to do, seething with rage and frustration. She walks up to this young person and goes through a litany of grievances that she had put together on these Snapchat screenshots. And in this moment, she gives her an ultimatum. She says, we can either talk about this or we can fight about this. Now, Jordan knows that in our urban assembly schools, we spend a lot of time teaching our young people how to solve conflicts, right? How to make good decisions, how to manage themselves effectively. But in this moment, given the public display, given the status difference between fighting and talking things out, and this ultimatum in public, they decided to fight. And afterwards, we sat with the assistant principal and the principal debriefing the situation between these two young girls. It turns out that the one young girl, a young woman I should say, was feeling frustrated, lonely, and isolated because the other young woman who used to be her best friend was now hanging out with a different group of girls. And so the question that I had when I think about violence in our schools is, how did this emotion, how did these feelings turn into violence? And what are the implications for how we think about violence and social and emotional development for young people in the school? And to do that, I want to talk about two of our challenges when we think about how we make good decisions and how we problem solve through the type of emotional distress that can lead to these situations. And the first is, we know that our brains, given other situations or all things being equal, prefer, right, to make shortcuts, quick decisions, use categories versus careful analysis and deep thought. Which means when we think about the quality of decisions that our young people make on a consistent basis, we need to understand that it takes practice and it takes energy. And we need to think about how we are arranging our schools that allow our young people to have practice, have feedback, and get this problem-solving time to be effective decision makers. And the second thing I want to talk about in this context is how we make decisions in the context of difficult situations. Now, we know that our brains prefer to take easily accessible information, emotionally salient information when making decisions, which means that the quality of narratives that our young people have and the types of things that they're thinking through when it comes to problem solving has an impact on what information, cognitive and emotional, is available for them when they're looking to make decisions. So the types of narratives that we're teaching our young people around violence, around decision making, need to be intentional, because violence is a decision. And so what should we do about this? I think the good news is that the field of social and emotional learning for the last 30 years has been focused on thinking through how we equip our young people with the types of skills, competencies, and attitudes to work through these type of emotionally difficult situations with success. Decision-making and problem-solving skills are the foundation of effective social and emotional development. 2017 in Child Development, there was a recent article by Joseph Durlak that looked at a meta-analysis over 20 years of the impact of high-quality social and emotional learning programs longitudinally on students after they were exposed. Students who are exposed to these types of programs were less likely to engage in risky sexual behavior, a decision. Students who were exposed to these programs were less likely to engage in violence and drug use, decisions. Students exposed to these programs were less likely to be involved in a criminal justice system, a series of decisions, which particularly for our black and brown boys is a difference between going home to your calculus and going home in a casket. And it's not just the series of decisions that make sense in that context. When we look at mental health, we look at emotional distress, we saw a lower incidence of that over time, which means that the types of problem solving that young people need to be effective are the types of problem solving that we are not teaching well enough across all of our schools in this country. In fact, when I think about this, the Department of Education puts out an encyclopedia every year. It's called the Encyclopedia of Ethical Failure. All right? I'm an Army reservist, I'm an officer, an engineering officer, and so we read these things. And it's this huge tome. It's got 600 pages of really clear examples of all the types of decisions that people have made that have led to ethical failure. I stole money from, the government when I should have paid them back. I didn't declare something on my taxes that we should. But for me, I envision for our young people an encyclopedia of ethical successes, where people can look and have narratives of challenges that people successfully navigated, because we know that they can do this. And that's why overall I'm optimistic about the future of our young people and the future of our country with regards to this issue. Because when I went back to that school about 6 months later, with high quality feedback and development, these young girls have learned how to solve their problems more effectively. And to me, in this world of Tide Pods and tweets, we think about Facebook and Snapshots. If young people can learn to solve their problems, then so can we. Thank you.
It's an honor to be here, and thank you, Felice and Vivian and colleagues. Let me start, now that I've listened to it, with a few stories that come from my work experience and research experience. Let's start with another Scandinavian country, Finland. I was part of an ASCD site visit, and I was the designated person to look at SEL and violence. And I said, I want to go to East Helsinki, which is a place that has lots of people who had emigrated from Eastern Europe as well as Africa, because I didn't want people to say it was just a question of common ethnicity. And I knew from before that in Finland they do not suspend students. So I asked people in this school, have you ever suspended a student? And they first looked at me and said, what do you mean? And then when I described it, they looked at each other. It was the principal, the vice principal, behavioral specialist, and they said, you know, yes, once. 5 years ago, there was a young man who set a fire in the bathroom, and we really were concerned that he was in terrible need. So we arranged for 1 week for him to study at home and get support. So we have done it. Now there's a cultural issue here. And that cultural issue is reflected in things like incarceration rates in the US, where if you go by 100,000 compared to other OECD countries, we're about 666 per 100,000, whereas we go down to Finland, or no, let's say Germany, much more diverse, it's about 66 if I remember the number. There is a cultural issue about whether or not one's committed to serving students. Second story. When I was starting to do work with the Chicago public school system that led to developing the Conditions for Learning survey, they said, we want you to see a school we're starting to learn from. And so they took me to a school, the original North Lawndale Academy. And it was a school in an area of Chicago that is rich with resources and also rich with violent challenges. And it was a school when I was there that had gone 186 days without a fight. And among other things, I said to the students, so that's nice. This is after I established a relationship, but what do you do outside of school? And they talked about the fact that they were a moral community. And because they were a moral community, they understood what to do, and they at least gave me examples of how they had handled it. It's the problem solving that David's talking about. But let me tell you another thing about North Lawndale that's very key. The head of the school decided not to have metal detectors, decided not to have security officers, and instead he deployed those resources so there were 5 counselors in this small school. 1 for every grade and 1 for the first year of college. Because the message that he gave to students when they came to North Lawndale was, this is not about graduating from high school. This is about graduating from college. And remember, as a moral community. And then the third thing is, because I knew the research on the combination of academic press and support that came out of Chicago, I asked the students if they were ever too challenged. And they said, no. I said, come on, you said you just described all the academic challenges. And they said, we see our teachers as another set of parents. We see our fellow and sister students as cousins. Now, it's not perfect. Lots of challenges. At the same time, it is possible to create North Lawndales. Third story quickly. Today, I got an email from the superintendent of schools, CEO in Cleveland, where he was meeting, as he does 2 times a year, with student representatives from every school. And they're not just the highest achieving students. And among the other things, they go over the school climate survey. And they use it Now, in this case, he emailed me because students had decided that, black students had decided that they really did not like the language describing them in the black category. They wanted it to be African-American, and that's now going to be what's going to happen. The importance to me is their ownership. Ownership in everything from how are we being named all the way to what they also do at the district level, but they also do when they go back to their schools, is going over those types of data with the teachers and with the staff in order to try to create an environment where schools can be safer. We know a great deal already. We know an increasing amount about the science of learning and the science of development and the effects of adversity and stress on people. We know that safety is not just physical safety, that it's emotional safety, that it's psychological safety, that it's identity safety, that it's intellectual safety. And it's in the short run and it's in the long run. And my fear, which I share with all of you, and Pedro articulated it, is that in what I think he called the hysteria, we end up reacting in a way that undermines the emotional, psychological, and identity safety in the short run, but also doesn't actually do a great deal in terms of the physical safety, because as you've been hearing from everybody, the best source of the solution within a public health model are the end users, are the young people who have a sense of what is happening, have a sense of where, where there are challenges. They see things that adults can't see. Mm-hmm. They see things that security officers can't see. When I've done research in schools, they've ended up saying, this is the place that the security officers are not going. This is the place you need to go. Mm-hmm. Students are not perfect, but they are more perfect as reporters, but more importantly, they have to own the solution. I was one of the 3 researchers in the Hofstadter book. And what has been scary to me in terms of reading it, and I mean scary, and not rereading it, because I've always remembered it, is that the issues that were dramatic then about the gun culture are even more dramatic now. But at the same time, we really are at a moment of opportunity if we don't succumb to that hysteria. And that moment is to build on what we really know more about in terms of how do you build conditions for learning, how do you build emotional and physical safety, and how do you do the things that you've heard from other people today that enable young people to really do the types of social problem solving individually and collectively, not only within a public health model to prevent things, but I think more important, to help schools become rich and engaging places that are equitable in terms of deep learning outcomes and not just factory outcomes. And those are exquisitely related to the extent to which we create environments that are emotionally and physically and intellectually and identity safe, and not just physically safe. And lastly, these issues are particularly important for young people of color. If you look at one of our best data sources, the CRDC, Civil Rights Data Collection, African American students are 3 times more likely to be suspended than white students, and we know that every day of suspension makes it more likely that people will drop out, makes it more likely that people will be incarcerated, makes it more likely that people will not experience good health outcomes in the long run. And if we replace counselors, because we don't have enough money, with more security officers, and if they cannot handle issues of implicit bias because they're not trained and supported in doing so, there is a chance that the slight movement we have made over the past few years to start to reduce discipline disparities will actually be reversed. Mm-hmm. But we know enough now that we can actually make a difference. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Is this thing working?
Yeah.
All right. Good afternoon. I want to thank everyone for coming, and I want to thank the organizers for including me, because I am something of an interloper at AERA. I've never been to this meeting before, and I had never done any research in schools before I embarked on a project which resulted in the book Rampage: The Social Roots of School Shootings. We began this project when I was leading the inequality program at Harvard University, and I had 4 exceptionally distinguished graduate students working with me who are now tenured faculty all over the planet, I'm happy to say. And we were responding to the call of Congress, which passed the Missing, Runaway, and Exploited Children's Act, an extension of it, that called for a study on the causes and consequences of rampage school shootings. This was not long after Columbine happened. And so we embarked on what was for all of us a completely disjointed study from what we had been doing. Most of my work is on urban poverty and social mobility and the dynamics of the working poor. It had nothing whatsoever to do, to be honest, with the topic we were asked to pursue, because in the places where these classic rampage shootings, which is a very specific subset of the kind of violence we're talking about today, the characteristics of these communities were almost exactly the opposite from what you've been hearing. These were almost entirely white. They were in communities that are extremely stable, no background violence at all. The most worrisome aspect of life for the parents and kids in these schools was whether or not the buses would arrive on time. Because in these rural regions, buses spend an hour picking kids up, and actually that's where some of the plots were hatched, on the bus, where kids were not supervised. These are not places where violence happens. There had never been guns in these schools. There aren't guns in those schools today. So none of the symptoms that you've been hearing about that are classically involved in the communities I've spent most of my time studying were present in these particular places. And we started off asking, why are these particular kinds of shootings happening in these places? These are places you've never heard of until the shootings happen. They are obscure, small, rural, isolated communities, or they are suburbs, and the predominant pattern is the first of those two. So the first puzzle for us was, why are these shootings happening in these kinds of places? And the answer was that if you are a young man, and it's always young men, who's having trouble fitting in, and who's experiencing a lot of social distress from rejection, the worst place to be is a highly stable community in which nothing much changes from generation to generation. These young people were going to high schools their grandparents had gone to. They were virtually the opposite of what we characteristically think of as the highly geographically mobile society that is the United States. These were rich in social capital, extremely well connected, parents and children and grandparents and children who'd known each other for generations. The teacher in the school was also the Sunday school teacher, was also the Cub Scout leader, and all of those multiple networks combined to lead people into an extremely rich relationship of multiplex ties, which is great as long as you're in the 99% that's doing really well. But if you are a round peg in a square hole in a place like that, it feels like a life sentence. The very stability that makes those communities wonderful places to raise kids, and that's what everyone will tell you, they're wonderful places to raise kids, makes it a pretty difficult place to grow up, especially if you are a young man who doesn't fit with the masculinity emphasis culture of that community. And that's generally what we saw with these shooters. They were young men who often had more intellectual interests. They were not sports inclined. They didn't fit with the kind of dominant culture that was emphasized not only in the school, but in the community as a whole. As the students told us when we went and interviewed them, nobody ever comes out to do a parade for the kids who have come home from the college bowl. They do a parade for the kids who come home from a football meet. And this was not to denigrate football, which can be both invigorating and a source of social engagement between parents and children and the townspeople and so on. But if you weren't one of those kinds of boys, you were on the social outs to begin with. What I want to do after having described this very distinctive kind of social climate is to go over 3 particular problems: why kids don't tell, why schools don't see it coming, and why the community doesn't see it coming either. So let me start with the first, why kids don't tell. As others here have observed, these are not spontaneous actions. They have been planned. In the shootings we studied most closely, there was evidence going back 9 months before the shooting itself that something was coming. And the shooters were broadcasting their intentions. Not in such definitive ways that it was easy for people in the climate, kids in the climate, to know exactly what they were being told, but they were hearing comments like, "You'll see who lives or dies on Monday," or "I'll be running from the police so you won't see me for a while." Comments like this going back 9 months ensured that there were lots of kids in these schools who knew something was coming. And some of them didn't turn up for school on the days that the shooting happened. They knew enough to know something very worrisome might be happening, and they didn't come to school. But none of them came forward to tell the adults in their environments. Why not? That is the first, and in some ways the most troubling question we have to ask ourselves. It is difficult for us to admit that young people live in a very different world from the adults that are around them, almost by design. In adolescence, they are looking to break away from adults, to establish themselves as more independent, and that creates a DMZ between them and the adults in their environment who might have been able to do something. Because if they come forward with the knowledge they have about the threats that have been circulating, they will be identified as teachers' pets, mama boys, kids who aren't really standing on their own, and so they don't. They also don't come forward because the signals they're hearing are noisy. They're not that definitive. What does it mean to say you'll see who lives or dies on Monday? If the source of that comment is someone who has for a long time been trying to get attention, trying to gain entrance to a clique, is constantly rejected from those cliques, this is the last act, not the first act. It's the last act in a long sequence of efforts to become socially accepted. But those other acts incline everyone around that young man to see him as someone who's constantly either telling odd jokes or making strange comments or trying to get attention. So this is one more crazy thing that Mitchell Johnson said. And that makes it very difficult for people to interpret exactly what Mitchell Johnson's trying to communicate until later. But if young people discover that something horrible really could happen, they start to overcome that reticence to come forward to adults. They start to take more seriously those noisy signals. If they feel that there are people in their environment, as others have pointed out, who will actually investigate what they've said and do so quietly, confidentially, because 99 times out of 100 it won't be anything. But the one time out of 100 when it will, that's when it really counts, that there is someone they trust that they can come forward to, often someone outside of the school disciplinary hierarchy altogether. Because one of the things young people in these situations worry about is if they come forward and they suggest that something horrible might happen and they're wrong, they will have gotten someone in trouble because those knee-jerk reactions that are guided by zero tolerance policy will kick in instead of a more nuanced policy, a more nuanced approach, which will discover the 99 out of 100 that don't mean anything and not get their best friend in trouble. These are the dynamics that are going through the heads of the kids who learn that these shootings are possibly on the way, and it is part of the reason why they don't come forward. There's one other reason, which I think is a difficult one for us to swallow. We found that young people in high schools, when asked what adults do when young people bring them trouble, don't have a lot of confidence that those responses will be respectful or nuanced. Very often they believe that they're being told, go away and don't bother me, I'm busy, or you need to learn to solve problems yourself because that's part of what it means to grow up. And so teachers, adults in the environment give off signals, no doubt unintentionally, that young people receive as not altogether respectful of what they're bringing forward. And hence they hesitate to blast past these barriers that I've already described because they don't think what they've told will be held confidential, and lots of the information we found suggested they were right. In fact, it's very difficult for people to take action and be confidential at the same time. That's actually an extremely difficult act for for law enforcement or disciplinary authorities to take into account. So those are some of the reasons why kids don't tell, and kids are the ones who most likely have the information needed to actually enact a preventative agenda. You cannot and never will be able to predict who will do this kind of rampage shooting. The shooters we studied, when we looked through the entire CDC database from the 1970s onward, came from stable households and troubled households. They were excellent students and terrible students. They were well-to-do and poor, and all the way around, the predictive capacity is almost zilch, and that's the Secret Service will tell you the same. In fact, that's where we started, understanding that it wasn't going to be possible to predict who would do this, which is why interdicting information is, in my mind, critical to the prevention process for rampage shootings. Now, why did schools not know? When we went backwards through these cases, we discovered, again, massive amounts of evidence that these kids were extremely troubled. But that evidence piled up in individual classrooms. It didn't add up in anybody's ledger to a portrait of that child that integrated either information that came across school boundaries, for example, between middle school and high school. Disciplinary records were shredded. There was no trail behind it. If it occurred in, if one kid was stomping on a fish, having pulled it out of a tank, or looking at pornography in the library, or turning in an essay in an English class that was murderously violent, the individuals who received those clues never put this together as a whole portrait of an individual. And that is because schools operate as loosely coupled systems. What happens in your classroom is your kingdom, so to speak, and there are very few mechanisms that have been set up to integrate that information, sometimes on purpose. We don't want to develop either a police state or a state of surveillance which is so strong that it will make it impossible for ordinary kids to live their lives. So we don't think, for example, that a kid who's had a bad year in 8th grade should be labeled in a way that causes teachers to see them coming in the 9th grade and assume that that's going to be a trouble case from beginning to end. There are virtuous reasons why we don't track these things or why we don't pass that information along, because we are a second chance society. We do want kids to be able to recover from a difficult year. But that very positive impulse, which I think is one of the most positive aspects of our second chance culture, also obscures pathways and patterns. So schools don't see this coming because incidents occur in pockets, because the mechanisms for pulling that information together are often discouraged, because disciplinary records don't follow students from one place to another, and overall because we want teachers to be able to be professionals, meaning the kings of their own classrooms, and that tends to militate against some of the information compiling that would make a difference. Notice, of course, there are lots of things that can be done that are pedagogically valuable and have nothing to do with discipline. We found that this information sharing was better where there's team teaching. Team teaching isn't set up in order to promote the capture of information about kids who are troubled. It's set up for all kinds of academically valuable reasons. But it has the side effect of providing opportunities to compare notes, and that's important. Finally, let me say just a word about why the communities didn't see this coming. In very, very stable communities, especially those that are isolated, people go a very long way before rupturing relations. So if they know, and they did know, that particular kids were troubled, rather than come forward to the parents of those children, they would avoid the conflict and stand back and try to find ways around it. I will give you one anecdote that was particularly moving to me. A psychiatric social worker who surely knows what it means when a young person is torturing animals, when discovered that a young man in the environment who became one of these shooters was doing so, and her daughter was afraid of him, afraid of being on the bus with that kid, she said, "I'll drive you to school." She never came forward to the parents, and this is someone who knew what this signal meant. Lots of parents were troubled but didn't know as well as someone with this kind of professional training. They worked around it, and they worked around it because if you live in a very stable community and these are your friends, and there won't be other sources of friendship if you rupture that relationship, you back away from that rupture. So highly stable communities have this unfortunate flaw. They are conflict avoidant. And conflict avoidance, again, restricts information, makes it very difficult to surface a kid who's in trouble, or makes it difficult to attend to that trouble. When we ask parents, would you come forward if you saw a young person in your environment doing something that was dangerous? The first impulse was say, absolutely, because that's what makes this such a great community to live in. We all care about each other, we never lock our doors, we all know each other, and we look out for one another. But about 10 minutes later, they would say, actually, if someone came forward and told me my kid was doing something dangerous, I would be suspect of their motives. I would start looking deeply into why they were bad-mouthing my child. And knowing that this was the likely response, parents who had real reason to believe that someone in their environment was very troubled tended to back away from conflict. So there are reasons why kids don't tell, there are reasons why schools don't know, and there are reasons why communities don't come to grips with the trouble mounting in their midst. There are solutions to all of these problems, and if we have more time, I'll talk about them later. Thank you.
Well, come forward to the mic because we very much want to involve you in the conversation. Did you prepare some? Anyone from our students who want to comment or kick this off?
Jordan,
All right.
So maybe yours is to the left.
do you want to talk about the march?
It is.
I put him on the spot. It's going to happen. You hang out with me.
Hello.
Hi guys.
Is that mic working?
Yeah, it's working a little bit.
Okay. So introduce yourself and we'd love to hear
I'm
from you.
Jordan Hennix. I go to Urban Assembly Media.
I'm Yadri Monsanto, and I also go to Urban Assembly Media. I'm Kyla Colon, and I also go to Urban Assembly and Media.
And you wanted us to talk about the march on the 14th, correct?
What was the impact on, and how did you think about gun violence in that context?
First off, it took a long time to plan out because, after all, we are just 16, 17-year-olds, but as only you know, our school is a complex school. We have 5 other schools in our building, so over the course of from May to March, myself and the two that stand before me were hoping plan how the march would look out. Because as we all know, protests could go 2 directions. It could be really violent, and being the fact that we're all teenagers, the first impulse adults will believe that's going to be violent. Or it could be a very peaceful protest, which actually turned out to be what was really great. I'm sorry. Oh, you want to? Can we keep going? All right. The day of the protest, at first, felt pretty nerve-wracking, but the more we spoke, the more people heard our voices, the more that people actually recognized us and see we're in the spotlight. It felt like we could actually change something, that people actually listen to our voice for once in a while. It didn't feel like, oh, another mass shooting has happened. This is my everyday life. I have to just be afraid of the fact that I could go to school and get shot. Even if there's metal detectors in my school, it doesn't matter where I am in the world, I'm not safe. Neither are my 2 friends. So what can we do about it? That's why I'm actually happy that we have adults like you guys that listen to us. Adults like you guys that actually look at the studies, see what kind of people need to be, I wouldn't say checked. Check doesn't sound right. But anyways, yeah, I'm I'm so nervous.
Okay. Continue to the whole protest situation at first. It was, as he said, very nerve-wracking because we had to come together as one. Our school has this thing called advisory leaders, which each student in every class has a leader who gives them information about what's going on and what's happening. So we had to get advisory leaders together, and we had to talk about how are we as a community going to take action, and how do we want to like give the communication or the message out to. So at first it was kind of rough because because we couldn't listen to each other. So one of us, me, yeah, I had to say it's like I had to basically shout or yell or basically speak out.
Like, go out your comfort zone.
Yeah.
In order to like really convey like the tragedy
Exactly.
that this is, and the fact that we amongst ourselves can like work together. How can we really be taken seriously? Like, one, we're underage, and people already look down at us. We're already a marginalized group, so us not coming together, that doesn't fix anything. We actually need to work together and see that we all have a common goal. What's the point of fighting in the first place? There isn't a point.
We thought it was like, how is our message going to get across if we can't get our message across to each other? And that's when everybody realized, and they were like, oh, who's scared, who's not? Who wants to take action inside, who wants to take action outside? And we basically developed a structure where some of us who were not confident enough to take action outside took action inside, and we held on to each other as a community, and we cried, and we cried really like a lot. We cried with each other without like judging each other. We basically, it was like, not all of us were students. We no longer were students. We were no longer kids. We were, at that point, we were leaders, and we felt like leaders. And when we were outside, we felt more like leaders because people were able to see us, and people were clapping, and they were like cheering us on, and it's like it built up our confidence more, and it was like very moving, yeah.
Okay, so I am actually a freshman at UAM Media. So growing up, I've always had my parents as a support system, and I've always been told whatever is right, you fight for no matter what. No matter the judgment, and no matter the size of your enemy, you always fight. So coming into this school, I had a very large support system in a sense of a community, a family that said, well, why must we be belittled? Yes, we are children, if you want to say, but we are the future of this country, of this nation, and we should be fighting. So it was very nerve-wracking going outside and sharing your opinion on such events, but I felt empowered, and I was honored to meet Whoopi Goldberg, who was actually entering ABC Studios and did chant with us, and she gave us more motivation to continue, and she said, well, do what you're doing and keep promoting, because if we just stay silent, where are we going to get in this country? Somebody's going to listen to us. We, like I said, are the future of this nation. We shouldn't be told that we don't have a voice, and we should be silent, because being silent is why we have gun violence in this nation. We are judged for who we are, and it isn't fair. So coming out and showing that we are one to the NRA is very important to all of us.
One more thing, when we were marching for the lives of the people, we weren't only marching for them, but we were also marching for ourselves. We all had a reason to march for something, even if it was like, oh, because I'm belittled in society, because I was bullied once, or because I was told by my parents that I couldn't do this stuff, because I'm too colored, or too young, or too something. But yeah, that day it was no longer like just for the people, but it was for us as one and us as a whole. Yeah.
Yeah. In addition to what Yadri said, it was like we're marching for not just ourselves, everyone in this room practically, because gun violence it could happen anywhere at this point. And like, exactly, it's really sad that we have to get used to the fact that our lives are in danger no matter where we go. Even if it's in the back of our heads, we all realize that. Like we recognize what happened yesterday, that there's gun violence, there's mass shootings. Today, we're all here talking about it. So my question is, what are we going to do tomorrow? Like, are we just going to sit here and just discuss about it together? What are we going to do moving forward?
Good point.
Exactly.
Thank you.
That's it.
I just want to give another round of applause to the young people who just spoke. It's not an easy thing. And I mean, this discussion is very important and very sensitive to me as well. And thank you all for being here discussing this sensitive topic. And I agree that, we need, more counselors. We need to support our young people. And as you guys said, obviously you have a voice, and we don't want to silence those voices because they all matter. They're all important. People are from different ethnicities, and like you said, like the communities are changing now. We have so many different things going on, and even as you said, Doctor, people have mental issues. Some of the people who have been doing these violent things and all of that, which is a very concerning thing. And what I've also been reading about is that something, actually we didn't really mention it much here, something that links all of the people, 26 out of 27 of the people who have been considered, the most violent of the mass shooters, is that they are young boys who are not raised by their fathers. And I think that's something that we need to be talking about as well, more as an academic community, and why that might be the case, and what sort of things we need to be doing to encourage families and strengthen fathers and leadership in the home, because we see the results of it all around us. So I don't know what you guys wanted to say about any of that.
Well, we're fortunate to have an expert in our midst on that very subject. Vivian, would you want to add some thoughts?
She's Felicia saying that I directed a research center at Penn that was called the National Center on Fathers and Families. So yes, and it's it was a 20-some-odd. The center was opened about 20-some-odd years ago, the issue, it's about having fathers in the home, and I'd be the first to say that. It's also about making it possible for fathers to be in homes, and the factors that without offering any, this is an excuse, but issues that have to do with just the poor quality of schooling for so many young boys, that ends up with them dropping out of school, the high incarceration rates. There's the school to prison pipeline, or there's the prison to prison, school prison to prison pipeline. Yeah. And so I think this is an ongoing issue. When we look at the database on the research database, there is so much more research, but the research is not necessarily that targeted on the effects of father engagement and participation on actual schooling and learning for kids. So we have a lot of research that says it's important for men to be there because they can support their kids, but the number of studies that actually let us understand the ways in which fathers actually matter, the diversity of ways, the issues that fathers will need to consider as they are a part of the families, because it's about fathers having leadership, but it's about mothers having leadership, and the fathers and the mothers talking about what that leadership in the home should look like. So I would agree that this is a continued compelling issue, but I think it's one part of a larger of the larger scope of issues that affect the ways in which marginalized groups have been treated in this country. So yes, the answer is yes, we should be doing better work and better research on the ways in which we engage fathers. But we should be also doing better work and understanding the ways in which the diversity of families that exist in our society are attempting to function. Yeah, I think I want to say one other thing too, not directly related to fathers, but just kind of general. This is such an amorphous kind of issue. I was sitting here and I was trying to connect with everyone was saying, and everybody was saying such terrific things, and just as your question and your fabulous presentations suggest. So this is an issue about gun violence. This is the title of this panel. But there's an issue of violence, because even as we sit here, there are security guards and police actually pulling kids out and beating kids up. And so when we are talking about gun violence, we're talking about a subset of a massive problem about how we treat people, David referred to, how we are preparing kids to talk to each other, and the ways in which adults are treating kids in schools and in public spaces. So there's a kind of learning continuum that's extraordinary that we should be, I think, attending to. And then lastly, just the issue of teaching. I was telling Felice, as you all were talking, that the thing that distinguishes you and the kids in Parkland and some kids that we're working with in Philadelphia is the fact that you all are exposed to people who are teaching you certain kinds of things. They're teaching you about your own power. And they're teaching, this is not just making you feel good, it's they're giving you the content to align yourselves with each other in a particular way. So I know I got off script, but I wanted to say that. Now, I'm happy to talk to you about other work related to fathers.
But that does raise a very important issue about whether schools, like certain communities or contexts, are hot spots, or whether essentially the governance, the stratification, and the rule systems within schools are, within certain schools and certain environments, facilitate sort of socio-emotional development and reflection, and thus that gradient is really important in understanding differential outcomes. Would anyone want to pick up on that and comment?
Yeah.
David?
Yeah. I think, first of all, what Felice is saying is right, and as David suggested before, we know a lot more now. Yeah. And I think what the most important thing that we have learned from basic as well as applied research is that there is an inextricable link between social, emotional, and cognitive development, and between the development of these attributes in individuals and the social and emotional quality of the environments in which they're in. And what we also know, given the motif of a public health and a tiered approach, is that you want to have a very, very strong, robust foundation that includes social and emotional competence development and creating ways in which people feel connected and abilities to work together, as we've heard from the young people here, and at the same time be able to identify warning signs early, and not warning signs of violence, warning indicators that people need additional support, so that we can enable them to succeed, so that we can enable them to work together. And to conclude, I think the importance of the interconnectedness of the different attributes is that you don't just want freestanding social and emotional learning programs, even though those were the ones in the meta-analyses and they can make a difference. What we really want to be able to do is integrate social and emotional and cognitive development into the moment-by-moment pedagogy of classrooms and the interactions that happen between everybody in the school community. And when that happens, not only do we create environments that are safer, not only do we create environments where the sort of things we're hearing about working together may be more possible, but in addition, we can create conditions for deeper learning. And what we found, for example, in Oakland, which was one of the initial Castle districts doing social and emotional learning, was when people did walkthroughs, those classes where you saw social and emotional attributes being realized were also the classrooms where you actually saw a deeper level of discourse and a greater level of metacognition. So we don't want to separate issues of safety and social and emotional development from academics and equity.
Can I just make
Yeah,
two quick
go ahead,
comments?
David. Yeah, and then Ron.
So I want to make a quick point about fatherhood and the social emotional development of young men. Fragile Families kind of research piece over at Princeton has been looking at this for a long time. And one of the things that's been frustrating me as a non-researcher, as a more of a practitioner kind of side of the piece, is that we are not, on the research side, forceful enough about describing how the quality and the structure of families impact the development, the social emotional development of our young boys. Yeah. We then incarcerate them, then we suspend them, then we put them away. We know educational achievement is related to fatherhood in the home. We know that anger management, social emotional development is strongly related to fatherhood. We know that census tract data shows that the number of fathers in a community can even impact social mobility. Social mobility of young boys is related to fatherhoods in the home, but we want to pretend that family structure is not something that we can talk about. So we need to get a better handle on being inclusive in the types of ways that we describe family structure, but being clear about what works and what doesn't. And right now, the quality of families that we have are impacting our young boys in ways that lend them to be more susceptible to types of violence that impact our schools and our communities and our development.
Ron?
Yeah, I want to answer that question in a flip way. My father died when I was 3. I was pretty much targeted because I was hyperactive and a pretty aggressive kid in schools and kicked out virtually every day by my principal. My sister had severe mental illness. My mother was suicidal growing up. So the story was that I needed a superego. And the solution was every time I did something bad, I was going to be spanked. And in principle, every time she hit me, which was almost every day, and it was legally allowed, my mother signed for it, would say, I'm doing this for your father who's not here, he would have done it for you. So for me, not having a father, so how did I end up here? I actually saw that principal a few years later when I was in college, and I said, you know, I made it here, and I was going to give her an earful for doing it, but she said, but there's evidence. You made it through college. So the solution and the causes have to be looked at very carefully, but I don't attribute it to what she did. I'm still very angry at her for doing it, because it has a butt imprint of mine on some wooden panel somewhere. But
I am too.
Yeah. But I attribute it to the social network. I came from an immigrant family that had a huge social network that had a vision for me that was different than what my family had for me and for what I had going on. And I believed in it, and I was supportive of it. Let me flip that to schools now. The causes that you heard about here may not be the solutions. What I think is if we could create optimal schools, and we did a bunch of studies in Israel and the United States, our books are based on these optimal schools. They're called theoretically atypical. They're places where everything should be falling apart. But it's not. Those kids are thriving. Those communities are doing really well. We don't study those enough. And there's a lot of them. In our work, it turns out between 15 and 20% of these high-risk areas actually have places that are doing really well. And their kids are doing great. And we don't spend a whole lot of time on what the kids are saying, what the teachers are saying, and we have to start building off of that group too. Those optimal networks that were created may have a different path to a solution. Now, it won't solve all the other problems. It won't bring my dad back. But it created a network for me and my group of friends. At the time, we're all gang members, by the way. Some are in penitentiary, killed other people. And I don't call it, and my wife doesn't like it when I got emails from different people who I've worked with and say, how come you're on the internet so much? But they'll find us. But that whole group is doing really well. And it's not because of all those causes, it's because of the settings that we went to, those relationships with those teachers. The optimal settings were not just fixing problems, they were creating different realities for us. And that was coming through a statement through society, that they're saying they had belief in us, and that was independent, I believe, of all the risk factors I was exposed to growing up.
So Kathleen, earlier you had said that you had some 2 cents to throw in around prevention. Does this speak to?
Again, going back to the very importantly subset of studies that we've done, which are really quite different in their object than what we've been talking about, where violence is a background aspect of daily life. In these rampage shootings in the settings I've described, we concluded that it was extremely important, and this is echoing points that were made by my colleagues, extremely important for kids who hear threats to have someone to come forward to that they trust, who will take that information and act on it quietly, and conscientiously, but take it and act on it. We see a very different pattern immediately after shootings. Immediately after rampage shootings like Parkland, there is a very sharp spike in plots on the way, a very sharp spike nationally in plots on the way. But there is an equally strong and sharp movement of people coming forward to report them.
That's right.
And the reason why those two things happen is that the copycat phenomenon kicks into gear, but so does the recognition that this could really happen, so that those threats I'm hearing could really mean something, and that causes a difference in reporting behavior. And this is why when I've been asked, whether media attention to shooters isn't making the problem worse, I always feel somewhat conflicted in providing an answer. Because if the media attention wasn't there, kids wouldn't know this could really happen, and they wouldn't come forward in the way that they do after these horrible events occur. I've often been asked whether or not violent media plays an important role. And the gun control issue is critical as well. Let me just provide two what I think are somewhat counterintuitive observations. First, violent media. There are some people who believe very strongly that violent media creates a kind of urge toward violence in kids who use it or see it. That was not our finding. Our finding is that violent media portrays men as masculine anti-heroes and makes them into admirable figures in this anti-hero way by linking them to violence. So that the popular culture imagery of men is so damaging because it provides a model for what these shooters think will make them more socially acceptable. And what they are problem solving. The problem they have is that their social image is damaged. The answer from their point of view is to find another social image that will work better. And the one they land on is the one that popular culture is providing them that links men and violence. And I think that is an extraordinarily damaging aspect of our culture. One other point about gun control. Gun control is exceptionally important, but not for the reasons that we typically think. A really dedicated killer will get their hands on a gun.
Thank you.
And the young people that we looked at had taken blowtorches to safes to get their hands on legally acquired guns. Someone else had legally acquired those guns. What gun control does is erect a set of frustrating barriers to someone who's much more ambivalent. And most shooters are deeply ambivalent about what they're going to do because they actually, shooters of the kind I've studied, they're actually not after killing people. That's not what they're trying to do. They're trying to create a social definition of themselves that is wrapped around that anti-hero mechanism. And they think, if I do this, other kids are, I have quotes from these interviews where they would say, what did you think was going to happen? Oh, well, I thought they would be my friends. They would come over to my house. I would go over to their house, and I would have friends now, which I don't have at the moment. One last point, and this, again, I tend to look on the dark side. When you've done this kind of research, it's almost unavoidable. But I don't think that we can elide the responsibility that young people have to their fellows. The kids who were around these shooters knew they were pushing buttons. They knew these were vulnerable, fragile young men who were socially on the outs. And instead of incorporating them and providing that social emotional growth, they pushed those buttons. They said, Michael, I want you to come to school with a shotgun and a trench coat. And Michael, who's thinking, God, I'd really love to have some friends, thinks, okay, I'll come to school with a trench coat and a shotgun, and he killed 5 people. Because what Michael was really trying to do was just find his way into the very last friendship group that had any interest whatsoever in incorporating him. And this became the social test, after which he could not back down. So we need young people to recognize their own responsibility in treating their fellows with kindness and respect and incorporation, because when they push those buttons, when they derive a sense of positive enjoyment from the rejection of others, that creates a sense of internal solidarity, there's a cost. It can be extraordinarily high.
What we'll do is we'll take 2 quick last questions because you've been standing, and then I'm going to ask each panelist 15 seconds. Let's answer the question of next steps, next research steps. Where do you think we go Tuesday morning when we leave AERA? Okay.
So I wanted to come up and say thank you to the young people, but also to apologize to you, because I feel conflicted. I feel like young people should have a childhood and a youth, and they should be falling in love, and they should be learning, and they should be playing, and they shouldn't be fighting. But I also think that something about the way that adults have been trained, we've lost our creativity, and we've lost our ability to ask you to tell us what we don't know, we don't see. We've lost our ability to say, what is it we're not hearing? What is it you're not able to tell us? What do we not see? Because we look for patterns and because we're looking for solutions, because we want to protect your childhood. We had the gift of a childhood and we want you to have it too. So we're looking for patterns. We're looking at how these things affect individuals by gender, by race, by class, where you live. But we're not asking the right questions. What is it that you want us to hear? And I wonder, to ask the panelists, what is it about our relationships of power with young people that makes them so afraid to tell us what is going on? What is it about this imbalance between adults? What happens from when we're your age to when we're our age that we can't see what you see, and why can't we hear what you need to say?
I'd like to answer that. There are schools where this does happen. I just want to put that straight out. That's what I'm saying. It's not all adults, it's not all kids. We have the examples of schools where kids do come forth and where tragedies are averted. We don't study that. We don't keep a whole lot of tracking or focus our efforts on that. But they're out there, and I would answer, we need to get other schools to do more of that.
I'd say briefly too, we had a panel maybe 4 months ago in one of our schools, and we had young people on the panel, and we asked them, out of all the social and emotional skills that you've learned and you're working on, what skill would you want your teachers to develop the most? And across the board, they said active listening, right? They said if our teachers would listen to us, they would understand what it is that we're going through, and we wouldn't have to have these fights in terms of teacher-student relationships. So I think to the extent that we ask students questions, we listen to their answers, and then actually try and make that happen, then we don't have to have a conversation where we feel bad. We can make schools a better place to be.
If I may just add one anecdote from research. Question was asked to 17 Mexican-American students in Texas, what would you tell a teacher to do that could make the class work better and be more focused? And they said, get to know us, know what embarrasses us, and don't do it. And I use that example because I think part of what happens is when teachers are unable, due to work stress and situations, to get to know people as whole people, they then sometimes unintentionally do things that are really embarrassing and off-putting, and they support the types of identity struggles that Catherine's talking about and identity needs.
One last
I wanted to start by thanking all of you for engaging in this vigorous conversation, and also just for the years of work that you guys have put into these issues. And my question is, I've heard from from many of you, sort of touching on like the culture. I mean, we live in a very violent country that has a culture of violence and a very bloody history, and there are also these different cultures of masculinity that obviously operate at the intersections of race and class, but both these cultures of violence and masculinity are inextricably linked, and they are sort of a thread that goes through all of the violence, the gun violence that you've all talked about today. And so my question is, a lot of the sort of ways to intercept these events that you've spoken about, I think are like at a school level or an interpersonal level, or even a structural or like a policy level, but I'm curious how you think that we can intercept the culture and kind of, because there's a lot of learning that has to be done, and that's what I think I've heard today, but I'm curious how you envision the process of unlearning to be done, like unlearning all of that exposure to these harmful cultures, and what would that look like? Yeah, what's your vision, I guess?
We'll take one response and then we'll do the wrap-up. Go ahead, Matt.
Well, I think one of the things that concerns me, and it relates to this and the marginalization and pushing out so many kids who are having difficulty, is that schools need to build new bridges to these kids who are isolated, who are marginalized, and find ways for them to experience different forms of success and social involvement instead of pushing them further away.
Okay, rapid fire. Your last shot, Ron.
Yeah, one thing I didn't mention that's we need to look.
15 seconds.
15 seconds is alternative schools. It keeps on coming up. We don't have a lot of research, and that's a missing link in the school to prison pipeline, and also with mental health issues, we need to reinvest in those.
Just pick up on the point Ron made that, what doesn't make the news is when there's not a school shooting. But looking at the places where you would expect to see violence and you don't, could tell us a lot about what it takes to prevent more of it. I would also say this, and it should scare all of us. There's nothing we can do to make schools or hotels or any of these places that we visit absolutely safe. It's because of the kind of society we live in. And that's ultimately the issue we've got to focus on, is how do we address the prevalence of guns in this country? Because that's what places all of us at risk.
Amen.
Okay, I think as researchers, we need to much more actively build partnerships at the community, state, and national level. Again, moving with what we know towards various forms of action, various forms of change.
I'm going to pick off of a concept that Ron put out for earlier. Number one, most of our work around the Urban Assembly is developing our teacher skills to interact and effectively develop relationships with students. If we could not have to do that 3 years, 5 years into the teacher's life, they could learn it in their teacher education program. They could value an identity around relationships. I'm not a teacher of math, I'm not a teacher of science, I'm a teacher of kids. Those are the types of changes that we need to be able to make so that we can bring our teachers in there, being able to make the relationships with young people and have them be successful.
3 data points. Compared to other countries like the US, OECD, the chances of a young person 5 to 14 dying with guns is 20 times greater than in the other countries. And for young people 15 to 24, it's almost 50 times greater. To your question, if you look at the history of the militia in this country, it was not regulated. It was about males and male privilege, and it was about race, and it related to issues of race control. And I think that part of the issue is also to really confront aspects of our history that are deeply rooted and connected to some people's notions of what patriotism is.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Catherine.
If I were going to work on this topic some more, there are 2 things I would be looking at that are very different from what I looked at before. One is social media and the ways in which bullying and social exclusion are amplified through social media. And I would also be looking at how we can use machine learning to, in the same way that we look at flu epidemics through internet searches, I would be looking at that. And the second thing I would do is to try to understand for those cases where the person is on the radar screen, which is what's really scary about Parkland. And it was what was scary about Virginia Tech. There were lots and lots of people who knew those shooters were deeply troubled and scary and threatening. I would like to know what happens inside organizations like the FBI when they receive thousands of calls a day. How do you pull needles out of a haystack? I would be looking at that problem because these most recent cases are particularly troubling. If you think the answer is, how do we make sure they're on the radar screen, and then we find out the ones on the radar screen, we don't know how to respond, I'd be looking at the needle in the haystack problem.
Well, I think we've been really blessed by not only a terrific group who came together for this panel, youth who really spoke so reflectively and powerfully that really helped to catalyze this conversation today. It's something that everyone in this room, it's palpable how passionately we feel that the knowledge must be produced, it must be used and introduced in important ways, and that knowledge really needs to build upon hearing all of the voices in the room, particularly that of youth. We need to create a kind of trusting space that also allows for different forms of innovative collaboration.
Right.
And I think the research community is there, and I think we need to figure out how to best partner to make that happen. So I want to thank everyone. I know I speak for Vivian, who I will give always the last word, but thanking all of you for coming and to recognize that this is a continuing conversation. The annual meeting is place-based, but this is a year-long project for all of us. Vivian?
I think we've thanked this. I want to thank this panel. You're outstanding, and the students. Just terrific.
Thank you for organizing it.